Welcome to Harlow on Healthcare. I'm David Harlow, and I invite you to join me by my virtual hearth as I sit down with healthcare leaders to discuss building the future of healthcare. Today, my guest is Krisi Hutson. She's a product line director at Availity. She has been there for over a decade and is working on a product team focusing on Availity's pre-service capabilities, and we're going to speak about the intersection of health information technology and the changing legal and regulatory landscape. Welcome, Krisi, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Terrific. So one thing that we can say about healthcare is that it's never boring, or it's never boring these days. There's always something changing. And one thing that has changed tremendously recently, or this is a significant move, is the surprise billing legislation that sort of popped into existence after many discussions and many attempts at the very end of 2020. So I'm wondering if you could say, for a moment, say a little bit about Availity and your work at Availity, and then let's transition into a conversation about what this means to your work and to the folks that you interact with.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, like you said, I've been at Availity almost 12 years now, so that over the decade mark. And when I start to look back before that, I spent around a decade in the private physician practice world. So I led a revenue cycle department for a large orthopedic group and had previously worked with some hospital systems as well in revenue cycle. And what really drew me to my current position in product development is I still have a passion to make sure that the technology that is offered to providers and to help support the payer network really does help to enhance the patient experience and make those healthcare transactions that they have to be a part of much more manageable and a little bit less scary when we can. And part of what we're doing at Availity with sharing some very high quality data with our providers and with our payer partners is can really help to contribute to this Surprise Billing Act and how to make sure that we can meet all the regulations that have finally come into law, something that I think we've been waiting on for a while. It took several starts and stops through Congress and came into effect the end of 2020 and is in preparation to go in, I think, in 22 when it will actually be in place. But it really helps to put patients at ease that when they are seeking medical care, that there will be no surprises, as it says in the title, right, in terms of what will their financial obligation be. So an analogy I like to use is you often, we say it takes a village, right, to do many things. As a patient, sometimes it's not extremely transparent as to who that whole village is. So you're going in, maybe you need to have a procedure done, you need to have a carpal tunnel taken care of, or something that could appear to be small, and you go to a surgery center to get that taken care of. There's many providers behind the scenes, everything from anesthesiology to maybe you need a piece of durable medical equipment to a lab that's needed for that procedure. And it's not simply one bill from your surgeon that you're very aware of. This Surprise Billing Act helps allow those patients to be more informed and really gives some guidelines to the providers and those provider organizations as to how they need to inform those patients of all providers that will be involved in their healthcare, whether those are ancillary services or primary services, and make sure that they have the option to seek in-network care or care that is the most financially suitable for their needs.
Do you have a sense, or is it way too early to say, who will this affect financially, right? So you can give a notice to somebody about this and they can choose a different approach. That works if we're talking about elective surgeries or something like that.
Right.
Many of these situations come up in an emergency situation. I know the law addresses air ambulances specifically, but there's plenty of other emergency services that are provided, whether it's ambulance or emergency room or surgery. At the end of the day, the expense, I suppose, the expense isn't going to go away, right? The bill isn't going to go away entirely. Maybe it gets reduced because of these regulations, but it ends up being paid either by a patient, by an individual, or by the carrier, by the person's employer. Do you think it ends up getting absorbed by employers or sort of ultimate payers of these bills rather than by the individuals? And isn't that just sort of part of the shell game of healthcare financing in this country, or is there some real change that's going to come here?
I think that's a great question. I think that there is going to be some bit of a shell game, and there's going to be some shifting of the obligation. And there actually are several, I would say, guidelines for arbitration that are laid out as part of the bill as well, or the act as well, in order to make sure that for services that are well and just services that were necessary for that patient, that there's a path to resolution for those providers and those organizations that are issuing that service. The air ambulance specifically, if you need something like Lifeline, you really don't have a choice, right, as to who your lift's going to be when you really need it. And I think that there is some shifting of that obligation. I think, though, where you're going to see some real change in the ability to make this more palatable for both the providers and the patients, there's going to have to be some greater, I would say, transparency and cooperation between large health systems and the provider or ancillary provider groups that they work with. So, for example, we've seen a trend in the industry every now and then where a whole anesthesiology group that provides the majority of anesthesia for a hospital might decide to drop out of network with a major payer because they can't come to terms for acceptable rates. But that hospital group, or many of the hospital groups in the area that they serve, are still within network. I think you're going to have to see some more cooperation, and you may actually see we see the tide twist and turn to where providers either choose to be independent or part of a large health system and owned. And I think you may even see a little bit of movement in that market so that they have more collective bargaining with those payer contracts.
It's interesting to think about how something like this might actually lead to further consolidation, which may reduce the surprise billing element, but may not, in fact, reduce in the long run total expenses for a payer, whether again, it's an employer, insurance company, or an individual.
And
it's an interesting thing to think about.
That's a bit of the lens that I've seen it through. And I personally live in a one hospital town, right? So, and there's many that of locations where that's not the case, right? And you have some more options in terms of where you're seeking treatment, but you will see in these single health system towns a lot where almost cyclically every 10, 15 years, it seems the tide turns and there are physician owned, then the physicians will move back out on their own. And it's usually around some payer contracting. So I think that having to have a unified front for the patients that they are treating and the ability to have a shared network status, I think we could see some changes there.
So we're talking a little bit about the relationship between different types of providers and the way they may need to change over time. But do you see a change in relationship between provider and patient that's related to all of this?
I do. And I think that it comes with the provider has, I believe, a obligation. It may feel a bit as an administrative burden, but healthcare in the consumer portion of healthcare, right? So the financial portion, the part that is a little bit not as elegant to think about as the treatment portion, that provider carries that obligation to make sure the patient understands what their obligation is, what the network status they have with the payer, and what the patient actually needs to be able to rectify in terms of the services that they're receiving, especially in non-emergent situations. I think everyone in the healthcare industry, right? You have anything to do with healthcare, you've always had those calls from, an aunt, a cousin, a grandma that says, I got this EOB in the mail and I have no idea what it says, right? Anyone who's had any experience with that, it takes a lot of.
Krisi, I have no idea what you're talking about.
You've never got that call? Kind of like
yeah, right.
In IT too, they'll say, my Google's not working. It's the same phone call that happens with, right? So I think that, and that just shows, and these are not people that, when you don't work with healthcare every day, it's hard to understand, why is my in-network different than my out-of-network? What does that even mean? What does my accumulator mean on my deductible? Why is it greater here that I thought I'd met my deductible. Why am I still, being charged something? Well, it's because I saw an out-of-network provider. There's many parts there that if you don't take the time to educate the patient and really help them to understand that, it can lead to some patient dissatisfaction as well as some very scary medical bills, right? Where often it's an interesting conversation I get into with providers about how there have been statistics that patient satisfaction actually will increase when patient estimates are created up front. It can be a scary conversation to say, I need to talk to you about what your financial obligation is going to be for your treatment. And that's often not what those in the healthcare field are skilled at doing or have the best tools to do. But when you simply inform a patient and you help them to understand what their obligation is, it really can help to make sure that they make the best decisions, both for their health as well as their financial well-being, and they can plan. Everybody can take care of the $100 bill that you get in the mail if you can plan for it much easier than if it just shows up and you didn't know it was coming. So the need to present those estimates up front and having some good quality data from those payers that through high quality systems within these provider offices can really ease some of that burden so that they can help to educate the patient as well as to heal the patient.
If you're just tuning in, this is Harlow on Healthcare, coming to you on Healthcare Now Radio. I'm David Harlow, and my guest today is Krisi Hutson at Availity. Krisi, you're talking about sort of the expectations, managing expectations and understanding what the bill is going to look like before the services. And as you're saying that, I was just thinking about the analogy that we often use, which is so out of date given the fact that none of us go anywhere anymore in the age of COVID. But the example that people always give is, the idea of going to a restaurant and ordering dinner and a bottle of wine and looking for a price and somebody telling you, well, we'll let you know what it costs in 3 months from now. And that's sort of the way our healthcare system works, but it just doesn't seem practical in any other context.
Absolutely. And the need to really inform those patients up front, I think is more prevalent than ever.
So every once in a while, I hear about some new tool, some technological tool or another, or some website that's going to help me know the price, the all-in price for something that I need in the world of healthcare in advance. And those often seem to be a flash in the pan. And there have been legislative fixes proposed and enacted, but not really implemented. So I guess I'm wondering, if you're a betting person, would you lay odds on this being fully implemented by the 1st of next year, or whenever this is supposed to be effective, or on whether we have tools that are available now or could be developed before the effective date of this act that would actually allow this to work in the real world? It's a nice concept, but the question is, how does it actually play out?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've thought about that quite a bit because it does seem to be start and stop in this a little bit. My personal opinion is that we will see more stickiness with this. We will see some greater effectiveness. But I think it is because it is focusing on the provider's obligation to inform the patient. And I think you're going to see technology firms maybe shift just a little bit from true direct patient engagement to providing the best tools for the provider to still serve as that conduit for information, or the provider's agents. So if I expand on that a little bit, I think what you've seen with some of the previous price transparency is the need to publish fee schedules, publish how much it would cost for a particular service, right? So you could go out and try to find, I need to have a total knee replacement. How much is that going to cost me at hospital ABC? There wasn't a lot of thought, in my opinion, put into how the patient could consume that information. So the providers were able to put out very technical pieces of information, codified. You would need to understand what procedures to group together, et cetera. And we're talking lines of thousands of procedures to sort through and figure out which 2 or 3 need to be added together to find your appropriate estimate. That's very
right.
difficult.
Some of us saw those. It was sort of laughable. We saw, CPT codes and dollar figures associated with them posted on health system websites. It's completely useless for the average care, right?
And it hit the letter of the law. It didn't hit the need of the consumer. So I think that if we see a focus on, help the patient to wade through the information by providing a consolidated estimate and informed consent up front, and really tying to those points where we're already getting consent for treatment, we're getting consent to release information. There are points in the process where patients are already engaging with their provider. By giving the provider tools to make it less burdensome to give an estimate of, we think this is about what your surgery is going to be, and based on what we know of your coverage, this should be your out-of-pocket. I think that's where you're going to have more success than by trying to put it solely in the hands of the patient. I think, unfortunately, providers should be focused solely on providing care. I think given the complexities of the system, part of that care involves helping to educate and inform the patient on the financial obligations of that care.
So where are we, do you think, on the adoption curve of that sort of communication between provider and patient? Some providers do pretty well at that, and I would hazard to guess that many or most do not, or, as you said earlier, tend to shy away from the difficult conversation.
Yeah, we definitely haven't crossed the chasm, I think, for sure. And it's funny that the journey has been long and slow. We mentioned I've been with Availity right around 12 years, and before that, when I was with a practice, I actually had put a financial counseling process in place. So we're talking 15 plus years ago that I had put a formal process in place for orthopedic elective procedures. There are many of the challenges that I faced 15 years ago that are still in place today. And at some providers, it's simply the logistics, right? So you could have a small office where there's simply nowhere to have a private financial conversation. While you can check someone in and say, Krisi, and I'm here and I still live at this address and I'd like to see this doctor, gathering information about their financial ability to rectify that bill and sharing, we believe your surgery is going to be $9,500 and you're going to have $750 that we need to work on arrangements for. That's a very different conversation to have in a small waiting room. So everything from physical space to the tools that it takes to come up with that $750 obligation have to move in order to move us faster along that curve. And I think there are technical solutions that are making the coming up with the appropriate out-of-pocket more palatable to the provider. It's making it a little bit less burdensome, but they're not perfect, because there are many ways that surgery could potentially change a little bit that would change the outcome. And it's never going to be a perfect science. One of the conversations that I have had with providers when they're looking for an estimate solution from my organization is that it's very important that you think about this is called an estimate and not a bill. So in your example of going to the restaurant, right, and ordering your steak and ordering your bottle of wine, it very clearly describes what you're going to have for that day. It doesn't give an option for the chef to maybe add on a couple of things in the kitchen and then let you know what needs to be paid for at the end of the meal. You have the choice. There are things that will change during a treatment plan that will keep this from being 100% accurate. And I think that we are getting hung up a bit on the desire for accuracy versus the desire to just have a bit of informed information shared with that patient.
Right. And at least a range and an understanding of what the variables might be that would lead to something going up or down versus that estimate. That's a very good point. Correct. So in the suite of services that you provide or the tools that you provide, are those directed at provider organizations, payer organizations, both?
That's a unique value prop that Availity has. We actually sit between the provider and the payer with both as our customers. So part of our ownership is payer driven. So we do have a variety of tools. We work with large payer organizations to help to make sure that the data they have to share with the provider community is very easily consumable, as well as accurate and as timely as possible. But we also have provider workflow tools and integration options where it allows that data that the payers are offering to be served up in the provider's host systems or through a workflow portal so that they can have access to that information. So it's a unique spot or seat in the stands for this change for sure, because with both customers, it allows us to have some pretty interesting conversations and the ability to hopefully move the ball in the right direction in clearing up those pieces of communication and those data exchanges.
So it sounds like there's a lot of pieces of the puzzle here. There's sort of just the actual data that needs to be gathered and cleaned and presented in a rational way. There's creating an environment for presenting that data. There's something that needs to wrap around the raw data, so to speak, so that it's understandable by your average patient, whatever that is. And is there anything else? Is there other pieces of the universe of things that we need to have in place here?
Really, timing is an absolute key to this. So it's really understanding that a patient's financial picture as part of their healthcare snapshot, right? And what their obligation is from a deductible today may look very different from tomorrow. So for example, maybe you are having some shoulder problems, right? You went and you had an MRI, you've seen the doctor, you need to have treatment. Your deductible is going to be met as those claims process. And depending on the order in which those various providers send those bills in, it will change or it could influence who you need to pay your out-of-pocket to. So are you paying it to the surgeon? Are you going to pay it to your family healthcare provider that sent you to the surgeon or to the radiology organization that did the MRI? And the timing of how those bills are submitted and being able to grab that whole picture so that your data set is most clear, that's a really key piece, I think, that is sometimes difficult for the patient to necessarily understand, because in their mind it's all the same, right? It's one course of treatment and everyone should know everything about it, right? But unfortunately, the interoperability just isn't quite there yet to know that all those bills are going to go in and process in the order in which they happened.
Interoperability. Well, that's a whole other conversation.
Absolutely.
Which we won't get to today. So to wrap things up for today, I would like to ask you, if you were to wake up tomorrow and find yourself 5 years in the future, what's one thing in healthcare that you would hope or maybe expect to find has changed drastically?
I think it's the ease of which we share information between both providers and payers. So it's being able to tear down some of those walls of this organization versus that organization, the radiology practice versus the surgeon versus the facility where you receive your services, and being able to have intermediaries like Availity and like shared payer data platforms where we can truly exchange information about our patients to help them be the most informed they can be, as well as the healthiest they can be, by being able to share not only their clinical but their financial snapshot related to their healthcare needs. So it's back to that interoperability word, David.
Yes. Okay. Well, you squeezed it in there at the end.
I did.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us today, Krisi.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure. Thank you again for having me.
You have been listening to Harlow on Healthcare. Join us at healthcarenowradio.com. Let's continue the conversation on building the future of healthcare together at #HarlowOnHC. I'm David Harlow, keeping the fire going and holding a seat open for you. Until next time.